Thank you for joining us today. Our workshop today, Teaching for and with Integrity, is kicking off our Integrity Week at the University of Calgary. We're so delighted that you could all join us. We would love to hear from you in the chat box where you're joining in from today, and because we know we have people from the University of Calgary and beyond. So welcome everyone to our session. And in case you're interested in the other workshops that we're comprising of Integrity Week, I've added the link to the Zoom chat box to you there. And so we'd like to get started today by kicking things off at looking at academic integrity through a teaching and learning lens. And I'll hand things over to Natasha.
We wanted to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nation, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nation. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. And as I share this territorial acknowledgement, I'm always reminded of the importance of relationships, of community and connections as we go through there. Knowing that all of those things feel very weird at this time as we're facing each other in two dimensions. I'm really thrilled to be here for today. And Anna, I see you are from Regina, Saskatchewan. I also hail from Treaty 6 and the Métis homeland of Lumsden, Saskatchewan. So nice to see people here from my home province as well. I think we've been sharing these from the chat and just seeing where folks have landed from. So Sarah, I'm gonna hand things over to you for the goals of the session.
Yeah, terrific. Welcome again, everybody. Love seeing where you're from in the chat. And today what we want to do is cast a teaching and learning lens on academic integrity. So we'll explore what academic integrity is in our higher education context. So if you happen to be joining from K-12, you may find some of this useful, but we're really going to focus on higher ed today. We're going to look at teaching and learning practices that can support or hinder academic integrity and how it's enacted in our classes. And we'll reflect on some of the fundamental values as they've been established through the global academic integrity community and how they're reflected in our teaching and learning practices. And we can have the next slide, please, Helen. I can sort of frame this. I put together this graphic adapting it from Lee Adams' work from 2016. And Lee Adams proposed that we can conceptually frame academic integrity through one of three lenses that can intersect and overlap as a moral issue, or as a policy issue, or as a teaching and learning issue. And to kind of give a little bit of background onto each of these, the moral and social psychologists were pretty much the first ones to launch academic integrity research in the first half of the 20th century. It was often framed as academic misconduct research, though, and looking at cheating behaviors and psychological aspects of cheating. And then into the 60s and 70s, there were some shifts in higher education that proved to be quite pivotal in how academic misconduct, student conduct issues in general were addressed, and particularly in the United States. With the social unrest that happened in the 60s and the 70s, students were protesting on their campuses, and universities in particular were trying to curb student conduct that they considered to be unsavory or inappropriate for students. And there were a couple of legal cases in which students took their universities to court. And their claim was that universities had no right to stop them from engaging in social protests. And the courts found in favor of the students. In particular, it shifted the university's stance, if you will, such that universities were relieved of their what was called in loco parentis function. So universities were no longer to act in place of parents. So things such as character education disappeared from university campuses in the 60s and 70s as a result of those things. Moral education was taken out of secular universities in the 60s and 70s. And so that really shifted this function of the universities, because before there were lots of regulations around student conduct, and universities could govern student conduct in ways that they couldn't after that. It also meant that many of the very punitive approaches to student misconduct were taken out, but it left universities in particular with a bit of a gap in what to replace it with. And what replaced the university regulations and moral and character education were policies and procedures. So in the 1980s, academic integrity became a policy issue at many universities. And that's when we saw the first academic misconduct policies at universities emerge. Most of our universities had never had those more than half a century ago, 40, certainly not more than 50 years ago, but in the last 40 years and beyond. And so looking at it through a policy and procedure lens, many researchers and advocates were looking at that for, say, the next 2-3 decades. But then at the turn of the millennium, there was another shift, if you will, in favor of looking at academic integrity through a teaching and learning issue. And so it became not only what students should do, but how can educators support them, and what is the role of educators in promoting and upholding academic integrity. So we see that these different lenses are still applied to varying degrees, depending on the discipline that you come at this from, whether you're an administrator and you have to engage in misconduct case management, whether you're only an educator, and even if you're an educator, what's the discipline that you come from. So the lenses are overlapping on purpose, because it's not that one has replaced another, but rather that they've been layered on one another over time. And so today we're going to focus on what you see is that orange square there, looking at academic integrity through a teaching and learning issue, because sort of over the history of the past 100 years, this is the one that's still most in its infancy and merits some deeper discussion. I will say, though, that in terms of academic misconduct being a moral issue, there is very strong advocacy now against dividing the world into cheaters and non-cheaters, that's generally seen as not being productive, but rather that there might be a continuum of behaviors with any variety of motivations. So I will say that the discourse around moral binaries or ethical binaries is one that advocates are sort of pushing back against. So we can move on to the next slide. And the next slide is, it's a question for you. So if we were in our Taylor Institute, we would do this in small groups, but we'll invite you to do it through the chat and reflect on sort of 3 key concepts that we'll address today. One is institutional integrity. And what does this mean to you as someone who's participating today? Every institution will have its own culture around this. And how would you describe academic integrity and academic misconduct? So we're interested to hear your views on these, and we'll give you just a moment or so to engage in the chat box. Okay, there's some great input here. And maybe we can kind of move on to the next slide, because we wanted to kind of highlight that sometimes academic integrity is used as a euphemism for academic misconduct, and it's really not. And it's also not the antithesis of misconduct. We'll talk a little bit about that, but sometimes people have asked us, how do we define academic integrity? What does it mean anyway? So this is the brand new, shiny University of Calgary statement on academic integrity that we've been talking about, and it replaces an old statement that was in our calendar. And I'll just put it there in the chat box so you can link to it, about what it's the foundation of the development of our acquisition of knowledge based on values. We'll talk a little bit more about those values later on today. Honesty, trust, responsibility, and respect. These are considered values that are shared broadly in the academic integrity community, even though they may have different interpretations. And that research integrity, ethics, and principles of conduct, so that's our code of conduct, are key to academic integrity. So that this statement really shows that academic integrity, student conduct, does not exist in isolation from research integrity, ethics, or personal conduct, that there are intersecting, we have policies and procedures here, and that we have these intersecting policies at the university to help us understand how do we advocate for and enact academic integrity. So this for us, we've now taken our institutional stance, this is in our calendar, that positions academic integrity as a multi-stakeholder responsibility. So it's not just all about student conduct and student do's and don'ts. Those still exist, but are complemented and scaffolded with other elements and aspects of academic integrity. And we can go to the next slide here as well. That statement on academic integrity complements our new policies and procedures at the University of Calgary that came out in 2019. And you may remember, if you've been at the University of Calgary for a long time, that we used to have our regulations in our calendars. So you may have remembered me talking about how there was that shift in the 1980s towards policies and procedures. We were actually, believe it or not, one of the last universities to go from regulations to policies. And so Susan Barker and her team worked for, I think she tells me it was like 6 or 7 years, going through various drafts and extensive stakeholder consultation as to what this policy at the University of Calgary should look like, because policy revision generally takes a long time, right? We don't do policies every year, maybe every 5 if we're lucky. But I see my name got put in the middle of the slide there. That was just because I was supposed to speak to the slide. But we have these institutional definitions of what constitutes plagiarism at the University of Calgary. How do we define cheating? What are other acts of breaches of misconduct? We'll talk about breaches of integrity or violations of integrity. So we define these as an institution. It's important to acknowledge that there are no universal definitions of these. Even in Canadian higher education, for example, universities and colleges will define plagiarism in different ways. So sometimes there can be commonalities, such as appropriation of text without acknowledgement. That's a pretty common one. But at the University of Calgary, we're pretty comprehensive in what might constitute plagiarism. We also have our own institutional definitions of what is self-plagiarism. Even though in academic circles, notions of self-plagiarism are contested, we outline it very clearly in our calendar so that students can know what to expect and educators know how to explain these things to students. Because even if somebody comes from another university in Canada, the definitions might be different. So questions around student and faculty mobility can come into play when we're talking about definitions. And so that will also lead us into a bit of a discussion around, what do we expect from our students and ourselves around behavior and the values that drive that behavior. So we can go to the next slide here. There is this intersection between behaviors and values. So our policies will talk about behaviors and misbehavior. So misconduct is often thought of as a set of misbehaviors, even though academic integrity is often framed as a set of values. But misconduct policies don't address values because we don't punish people for having bad values. We don't have to take action or investigate anything for inappropriate values. But we articulate these values, and I'll get to those in just a second. But there's the idea that values will drive behavior. But when we're dealing with breaches of integrity or violations of integrity, what we're dealing with are a set of inappropriate behaviors. But to point out that there is this kind of intersection between what we believe and how we enact what we believe. And this is more prevalent in the academic integrity discourse than a set of regulations that can be just used as sort of a checklist culture, which can be seen often as being too reductionist. So even though we provide definitions, we also want to encourage thinking about what the definitions mean, have people think about their values and their values as situated within their learning community and even within a broader societal community. There is growing evidence and now repeated studies to show there's a connection between academic integrity in the classroom, be it face-to-face or virtual, and ethics in professional conduct or life. So one of the things that I talk about when I'm talking with students is that academic integrity is not just about what to do and what not to do. It's about ethical training and ethical decision making for life, and that's why this is so important. And so this can help to frame really more productive conversations, that this is our training ground for helping students to conduct themselves in ethical ways when they graduate, because it makes a link between what we're doing in our classes and beyond. So even though 50 years ago, universities were largely relieved of their in loco parentis function, we can still talk about ethics in the workplace and ethics in life without taking on that role of being a parent or engaging in the character education that was taken out of most post-secondary curricula so many years ago. But to kind of think about that, and that becomes really productive ways of talking with students about it. So I'm going to hand things back to Natasha now to have a bit of a conversation about values.
Yeah, and I think maybe what we'll do, Sarah, I think we've got some time, we've been chatting for a bit, is if we can, I'm going to put up a link here in the chat here that will link you all to a Jamboard. And that Jamboard essentially is an online whiteboard. It has one question that says, what values do you most associate with integrity? But I think maybe what we'll do is we'll let you process this a little bit in groups. We'll break you up into groups for about 10 minutes. Sarah, does that sound okay? Okay, awesome. So Sarah, if you can break people into Zoom breakout groups, we probably need about 4 groups maybe with the number of folks we have. And then what I'd like you to do is in your small group, have a conversation about the question that's posed here. What values do you most associate with integrity? Have a conversation, link to your Jamboard and add your thoughts as your group discussion is developing, and we'll bring you back in about 10 minutes. So for those, I'm sure that most of you have zoomed out into Zoom rooms. Go ahead and join your rooms and we'll check on you. Feel free to ask questions if you need to. Hopefully we got folks into, I think there's a few people who might be joining on multiple devices, so maybe there isn't that many.
Okay, fair enough. Just noticed one of the rooms has only 2 people in it, so hopefully they're having a
literally zooming through this 1-hour session on academic integrity. Really appreciate you all participating in those breakout sessions. I know we're waiting for a few more of the groups to come back. There we go. I think hopefully folks can see my screen here. I'm just making sure I am not on mute, which I am not anymore. So many different aspects of your being on your cognitive load in these online sessions. But just want to really have you have a look at these values, because when we think about academic integrity, we're often coming back to some core values. And core values stated by the International Center for Academic Integrity really align with what you've said here. Their 6 fundamental values, which we'll show after this, are honesty, trust, fairness, respect, responsibility, and courage. And I think a lot of what you've shared here align with and build on those values. But I think what we really need to consider is how are we, and when I say we, the entire academic community that supports teaching and learning, and engages in learning, so students and educators, how are we modeling and demonstrating these values in our everyday practices, and how are they really aligned with academic integrity? So I'm going to stop sharing for a second. And again, thanks again for collaborating with your peers in that Jamboard session. We'll take you back to those Jamboards near the end of the session. So Helen's just going to start sharing the slides again. And again, we'll reiterate those values, those 6 fundamental values on the next slide. Again, of honesty, trust, fairness, respect, responsibility, and courage. And this really leads us to what I think the fundamental framing of our session is about. And Helen, or Sarah, if I can ask you to rotate the slides forward again, is really, and never has this become, I think, more prevalent than as our pivot to online and remote learning happened during COVID-19. But really what we're starting to really shift in the conversation of academic integrity is how are we reframing the driving question from how do we stop students from cheating to how do we ensure students are learning? So really thinking about academic integrity as a cycle and as something that we need to look at in all of our teaching and learning practices. And for me, one of my roles during our pivot was to bring some of the teaching and learning issues that we were hearing from across the academic community to our academic crisis management team at an institutional level. And I think when this notion became so prevalent was when final assessments became due in March, when we were all thinking about, wow, our traditional assessment practices really are not aligned with the online environment, and how are we ever going to manage for academic integrity in these spaces? And I know Sarah's provided a lot of leadership in that area. We haven't solved or solved all issues to date, but really what came up in those conversations is how are we designing meaningful and authentic assessments that align with the learning goals and support students' learning, regardless of the environment that we're in. So I'll get you to move the slide forward, Helen, again. When we're also thinking about academic integrity, I think what we need to think about is the complexity of supporting academic integrity from a teaching and learning perspective across multiple, not only organizational levels, but multiple societal levels. And Sarah, did you want me to take the lead through some of these? Okay, so Helen, if I can get you to initially, so those levels are typically conceptualized at a mega or community level, at a macro or institutional level, at the meso level or departmental or faculty level. I'd also add working group in there, and at the micro level for individual learners, faculty, and staff. And if I can get you to advance the slide again, Helen. So when we're thinking about academic integrity at the community level, and I think social media and some of Sarah's leadership, both nationally and internationally, in thinking about how are we actually talking about integrity as a post-secondary sector? How are we creating networks of knowledge sharing to learn how we are supporting academic integrity at our institutions? Where are we having conferences? How are we engaging in scholarly work around academic integrity? How are we creating communities of practice? And I can tell you, just being part of a network of educational developers across Canada, we're in constant conversation and sharing resources around how we are promoting academic integrity, especially in online and remote environments right now. From a macro level, or institutional level, here is where we really take a close look at our institutional policies, our structures, the vision that the institution has and how it promotes academic integrity and governance across the institution. So how are we actually adhering to the policies? The University of Calgary, for those of you who are here, you may know this, but we've really taken a close look at both our academic integrity and academic misconduct policies over the last 2 years. Coming up with an institutional statement on academic integrity for an academic calendar is a huge feat for an institution. And I think we've seen that shift from misconduct to integrity starting to happen more and more at the University of Calgary. I'm gonna jump to the micro level, and then I'm gonna come back to the meso level. At the micro level, we're really thinking about how are we developing individual expertise and knowledge and awareness around academic integrity, including academic misconduct, with individual learners, with faculty, and with staff supporting instruction. So this is where we really think about the informal program supports and resources we are providing, the formal program supports and resources we're providing, but also the informal conversations that happen that help to support our entire network and support shared knowledge sharing around academic integrity. The reason why I skipped over the meso level is here's where I think we really have a bit of a gap in higher ed. And this is really about how do we ensure that individuals and at the individual level and at the macro level, that there's alignment there and that folks feel supported in terms of academic policies activities, policies, behaviors at the departmental or faculty level. So how are we ensuring we have appropriate leadership and governance set up in those faculties and departments that's consistent across the institution? How are we suffusing integrity into our academic programs? Are we having conversations about meaningful and authentic assessment in our curriculum review processes? How are we developing local leadership? So local leaders that can share about the successes and challenges related to academic integrity in our departments, and how are we sharing that knowledge across departments and faculties? So I think that is where we really need to focus, not only at our own institution, but I think across, as we're starting to look at how we support academic integrity moving forward. We've really seen a lot of movement at the macro level in developing those policies and structures, and more work on the micro level and ensuring folks feel that they have the expertise to support academic integrity, but it's a real challenge now in translating that into action and practice at the MESO level. Sarah, do you have anything to add there?
We just gave a quick plug in the chat box, but for anybody who might not be monitoring the chat or maybe watching the recording later on. And by the way, the session's being recorded, but the chat won't be captured. In terms of the mega level or the community level, one of the things that we've started during the pandemic was, we call it Integrity Hour. And we meet weekly, Monday mornings from 10 to 11 Mountain Time, and we gather in Zoom, and it's all higher ed. It's educators, but it's also student affairs professionals. We have administrators, and it's a really safe space for people to talk about emerging issues that have particularly come out during the pandemic. And we will often talk about complexities that are facing multiple institutions. So sometimes someone will bring forward, they're saying, hey, this is happening at my institution. Is anybody else experiencing this? And then one participant described it as a way of crowdsourcing information. And so we've really been able to help one another and leverage our knowledge about what's going on. So if that's of interest to you in carrying on the conversation, we welcome participants. We often have participants from 3 or 4 provinces join in. And I think we have some participants from some regulars, if you will, from Integrity Hour who've joined us here today. And it's been a wonderful way to connect with colleagues across the country at both colleges and universities to find out who's doing what and how can we help each other do it better.
Great. So we'll just go on to the next slide. We're going to have you think a little bit closer to and just introduce you to what we're referring to as kind of a life cycle of integrity for instructors or educators. So this is really taking it down to the micro level. What can we do as instructors to help support academic integrity across the institution? And we've really broken this down into 4, they look like discrete areas, but sometimes they overlap. 4 areas here. One is modeling. So how are we modeling and affirming the values of academic integrity? The other is teaching. So how are we designing our teaching and learning activities, assessments, goals to help support academic integrity? Where and how are we clarifying expectations around academic integrity in our courses and programs? And finally, how are we upholding the standards and practices of academic integrity? So we're going to break you into groups for another 10 minutes. We're going to invite you to go back to the Jamboard. The following 4 Jamboards has these words on them. And what I'd like you to brainstorm in your groups and add as many ideas as you have as possible. What actions, behaviors, or activities can you have in each of these areas? So what specific behaviors and actions will you take to model, to teach academic integrity, to clarify expectations, or to uphold the values of academic integrity? So I think we'll have 5 or 10 minutes. Sarah, do you think that's okay? Or okay.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think we just need the Jamboard link, and I'm going to go ahead and open those breakout rooms again. And Helen, feel free to pause the recording while we're in the breakouts.
So I think we're just waiting for a couple more folks to arrive. Elder Reg Crowshoe, who's our elder in residence at the University of Calgary, was talking about how Zoom had literally created transformation of thinking about the smudging as ceremony. He said that when you smudge, you pray for your ancestors and your community to come in with you. But in Zoom, it literally happens. It was pretty funny. You literally Zoom your spirits in. So we can all think of that today. So great to see folks turning back. I know these are relatively quick sessions, but I am really interested in hearing what kind of resonated with you when considering all of those 4 areas of kind of this life cycle of integrity for instructors, and maybe what questions remain for you. So I'll turn it back to folks. And I'll just flip through these Jamboard slides as we go on. I'm okay with Zoom silence too.
Something that resonates with me through all of the different aspects is the need for clear communication. And not just communication between the instructor and the student, but the communication between instructors and between faculty, as well as that communication between senior leadership and faculty, so that common language is being used, that no matter what classroom a student goes into, even if the expectations might be different, the language is still the same. I think that helps with our international students. It helps with our Indigenous students. It helps with our non-sequential students. That communication is so valuable and important.
Oh, I couldn't agree more with that. And even I'm starting to think of when our institutional policy came out, it's one thing that the policy's there. It's another thing about how that's interpreted within each faculty and sometimes within each department. What are the standard practices that are put in place related to that? Because a student doesn't experience it doesn't experience a faculty. They experience courses within a program that typically typically run across faculties, right? So that notion of having common language is so important. Any other comments? I think something that we might want to touch on, so when we talked about modeling integrity, a lot of that comes from thinking about what we're doing in our own practice, teaching practice to model integrity, but remembering that really those values of integrity should be something that we're modeling in our everyday practices, whether it's in our service, our community engagement, our research, or our teaching practices. But really that notion, I think, that comes up is really thinking about giving credit when using other people's resources, but also having conversations about integrity and designing meaningful assignments. We thought about, again, what instructors can do in their teaching practice. Again, really important to think about assessment. I remember when I first got into educational development, I read a paper by Carl Wyman. It was the "Why Don't We Try a Scientific Approach to Teaching Science Education?" And one of the quotes from his paper really stood out for me. And it was, we put an incredible amount of time thinking about our individual lectures and ensuring engagement in our lectures. But we put less time often into our assignments and assessments, which is probably the biggest error we make in higher ed, because it's actually assessment that drives what, when, and how students learn. So something that I've always thought about when thinking about designing courses and working with other educators to do that. Clarifying the expectations related to integrity. I think this really links to the notion of communications, and we must take this beyond the course outline, that these need to be everyday conversations that we have within the context of our discussions in class and our assessments as well, and clarifying expectations around writing, around collaboration, of course, right now is a big topic. And I think now also perhaps around maybe services that have been created that students think might help them through the process. So Sarah, just wondering on the last one, upholding the values of integrity, somebody put this around open discussions around the predatory companies and the cons of using them. So contract cheating, talk about new frames of academic integrity, I think has proliferated across the AI landscape over the last year or so. But so Sarah, do you want to touch base on that?
Yes, I do, because Integrity Week at the University of Calgary is built around the International Day of Action Against Contract Cheating. And this was started to also line up with Global Ethics Day. And so the International Center for Academic Integrity has launched this global initiative called the Day of Action Against Contract Cheating. So this is the 5th anniversary of it. And this year, all of the events are virtual. It's very cool what they've done. I'm going to put a link in the chat box, because it's something you could talk to your students about, because they can watch it. There's going to be 20 hours of live streamed content from around the globe, everywhere. I mean, literally every continent in the world is chiming in. So they've done it in hour-long chunks. Students will be giving presentations, profs from all different countries, to talk about contract cheating companies and how we can take action against them, because these predatory third-party industries are out there really, trying to take our students' money, and they really don't care if students are engaging in misconduct. So there's an awful lot of myths around them. And if you're unfamiliar with the term contract cheating, you may be familiar with the more antiquated terms of essay mills or term paper mills. Contract cheating company was coined about 15 years ago to talk about all kinds of academic outsourcing in both text-based and non-text-based disciplines. So this is actually a great link to share with students, because they're going to be live streaming it on YouTube and I think on Facebook as well. So students can chime in and watch from anywhere from the world. And in fact, there's a Canada hour happening. And okay, just to show you how cheesy I am, I actually made my first trip to Tim Hortons in about 6 months so I could get a Timmy's cup to use during the Canadian hour. And our theme is unapologetically Canadian, taking action against contract cheating. So we'll be having a little play on how Canadians apologize for everything, except we're not apologetic about taking a stand against this. So that's my plug for the International Day of Action. So I'm going to be watching some of the other 19 hours, not all of them, of course, but pretty excited to see the amount of global action that's being taken against this.
Great. And so the last, what we really wanted to leave you with here is that really when we're thinking about having conversations with academic integrity, especially with other instructors at our local level or within our local context, we need to think broadly about how we are modeling academic integrity. How are we designing in our teaching and learning practices to support academic integrity? How are we clarifying those expectations? And how are we upholding the values of academic integrity? And in that upholding area, if we're making things too difficult for individual instructors to report things, that's going to hinder the process of being able to uphold those. So really a lot of conversations happening at departments and faculties across all of our institutions on supporting academic integrity across multiple levels. So we're just going to wrap up. We only had an hour today. We'll wrap up with the final slide. What we wanted you all to do is to take 30 seconds. And Sarah, do you want to introduce this next slide?
Yeah, just kind of reflect on what was your key takeaway from today. What will be the things that you go and talk with colleagues about and your students about, and what's one thing that you could maybe use in your own teaching practice tomorrow? We really wanted today to be focused around teaching and learning. So what are you thinking about, and what's one thing that you might do as a result of joining in today? So feel free to let us know through the chat box. And also, if you have questions for us, we welcome your questions, and they might also give us ideas for future sessions. So if you found today helpful, we welcome your input on what might be helpful for future sessions.
Feel free to leave your reflections in the chat about one key takeaway or one thing you could use.
Great, thank you for that. And if for any reason you couldn't get the PDFs to download, then just pop me an email and I'll be happy to send them over. And maybe while we're just wrapping up as well, in addition to Integrity Hour, which happens every week, we also have an email listserv. I know that sounds kind of old school and 90s, but it really does help to keep us connected. And it's mostly folks from Western Canada, but we invite guests and visitors from other jurisdictions, though we do limit it to people who are directly involved with education. And so if you're interested in being part of our listserv, we share information about like these upcoming webinars or news stories of interest, those kinds of things. And again, feel free to pop me an email and I don't sign people up on your behalf, but I can send you an invitation to subscribe yourself.
Yeah, the 4M framework is quite transformative when you start thinking about that at your local, within your local context. It's been really helpful for me for my own practice as an educational leader. Well, thanks everyone for coming. We really appreciate you being here today. We know that was a whirlwind of a session, as they usually are at noon. I hope you had some time to grab a bit of lunch and hopefully you have some time to take care of yourself and others today. I know this is not an easy time and really appreciate you taking the time to come here today.
Thanks everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.